The autumn evening cast long shadows over the Parker household, the fading sunlight filtering through half-drawn curtains. Elizabeth Parker stood in the hallway, her hand frozen on the brass doorknob of her son's room. It had been a long day at work, her mind cluttered with spreadsheets and deadlines, but the faint, uncharacteristic sounds emanating from within had drawn her attention. She hesitated, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from an instinctual sense that what lay beyond the door would change something irreversibly. Elizabeth had always prided herself on her relationship with Owen. At 19, he was no longer the bright-eyed boy she used to walk to school, but a young man with a guarded demeanor, one who often buried himself in his room behind layers of silence. As a single mother, she had done everything to ensure he felt loved, even as their lives were shaped by the absence of Wilson, her ex-husband, who had walked out 10 years prior. Still, their bond had grown distant, and tonight, that gap felt palpable. Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth pushed the door open gently. The room was dimly lit, the only source of illumination coming from the desk lamp in the corner. Owen was sitting on his bed, his back hunched, his body tense. In his hands, he held his phone, and his face flushed with the unmistakable hue of embarrassment. He jerked his head up as the door creaked, his eyes wide and startled. "Mom!" he exclaimed, his voice breaking with equal parts guilt and panic. He scrambled to hide the phone beneath a pillow, his movements clumsy and betraying his discomfort. Elizabeth's first instinct was to apologize and retreat, but something rooted her to the spot. Perhaps it was the way Owen avoided her gaze, or the realization that his embarrassment ran deeper than a teenager caught indulging in a private moment. She didn't need to see the phone's screen to understand. "I knocked," she said softly, though she hadn't. Her voice was steady, maternal, the kind she used when Owen was a child and had scraped his knee. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Owen didn't respond, his shoulders hunched and his face turned away. The room smelled faintly of laundry detergent and teenage musk. Elizabeth glanced around, taking in the scattered textbooks, an unmade bed, and a desk cluttered with notes and energy drink cans. It was a snapshot of her son's life, chaotic, vulnerable, and at this moment uncomfortably exposed. "Are you okay?" she asked after a pause, her tone carefully measured. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He shifted on the bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Elizabeth sat down on the edge of the bed, maintaining a careful distance. "Owen, you don't have to feel ashamed. Whatever this is, I'm not here to judge you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken understanding. She could feel the heat of his embarrassment radiating off him, but she also sensed something deeper, an unvoiced plea for reassurance, for connection. Owen finally turned to face her, his expression a mix of frustration and vulnerability. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Try me," Elizabeth replied, her gaze steady. He hesitated, his hands twitching nervously. "It's not. It's just something I was curious about. It's not a big deal." Elizabeth nodded slowly, giving him space to continue. When he didn't, she decided to shift the focus. "Owen, you know you can talk to me, right? About anything. I've been your age before. I know what it's like to feel confused or curious or lonely." The word lingered in the air, striking a chord in both of them. Owen's eyes flickered with recognition, and for the first time, his posture relaxed slightly. "It's just," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "I don't know. I don't want you to think I'm some kind of freak." Elizabeth's heart ached at his words. "You're not a freak, Owen. You're human. And humans are messy and complicated. That's part of growing up." He glanced at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's just hard," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Sometimes I feel like I don't even know who I am, or what I'm supposed to do." Elizabeth reached out, placing a comforting hand on his knee. "That's normal," she said softly. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. But you don't have to figure it out alone either." For a moment they sat in silence, the tension in the room dissipating. Elizabeth could feel the weight of her son's struggles, and it reminded her of her own journey, navigating a failed marriage, raising a child on her own, and dealing with her own feelings of inadequacy. She had spent years putting Owen first, neglecting her own needs and desires, and now, sitting here with him, she wondered if she had done him a disservice by hiding her vulnerabilities. "Owen," she said gently, "whatever you're feeling, it's okay. You don't have to be ashamed of it. And you don't have to go through it alone." He looked at her, his expression a mix of relief and uncertainty. "Thanks, Mom," he said quietly, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. Elizabeth nodded, her heart heavy yet hopeful. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. "I'll give you some space," she said, heading for the door. As she reached for the doorknob, she paused, glancing back at him. "Just remember, Owen. I'm here for you. Always." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I know." Elizabeth stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind her. She leaned against it, her mind racing. The interaction had stirred something within her, a mix of maternal protectiveness, empathy, and an unsettling realization of her own loneliness. She knew this was just the beginning of a conversation that needed to happen. But for now, she resolved to take it one step at a time, determined to bridge the growing distance between them. The evening outside had darkened, the last rays of sunlight disappearing beneath the horizon. Elizabeth stood in the hallway, her hand lingering on the doorframe, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had seen, and what it might mean for their relationship moving forward. With a deep breath, she turned and walked away, leaving the shadows of Owen's room behind. But the questions remained, lingering like the echo of an unspoken truth, waiting to be addressed. The hours after Elizabeth's conversation with Owen were restless, her mind replaying the moment over and over again. The fragile connection they'd established left her feeling equal parts relieved and uneasy. Though she had assured him of her understanding, she couldn't shake the nagging thought that she might not fully grasp the depth of what Owen was going through. She found herself wandering the house aimlessly, tidying already neat spaces, searching for distractions to push away her growing concern. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Elizabeth sat in the dimly lit living room, a cup of tea untouched on the coffee table. She stared out the window into the quiet suburban street, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. It wasn't the first time she felt this way. Adrift, isolated in a life that once revolved entirely around being a mother. Owen had grown up so quickly, and she had invested so much in him that she barely recognized the woman she had been before his birth. Her thoughts turned, unbidden, to Wilson. He had left when Owen was just 9, and since then she had played the roles of both parents, sacrificing her own needs in the process. But now, as she faced this delicate situation with her son, she wondered if her sacrifices had left Owen without the kind of emotional guidance he needed. The sound of soft footsteps broke her reverie. She turned to see Owen standing hesitantly in the doorway, his shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing himself for rejection. He had changed into a plain t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair tousled from restless sleep or lack thereof. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice gentle but steady. He shook his head, walking slowly toward the couch. "Neither could you, I guess." Elizabeth gestured for him to sit beside her, and he complied, keeping a respectful distance but close enough for her to feel the tension in his posture. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "Owen," she began softly, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier. About feeling like you don't know who you are or what you're supposed to do." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the edge of the coffee table. "It's not easy," she continued, choosing her words carefully, "being your age. There's so much you're expected to figure out, and sometimes it feels like no one's there to help you make sense of it. He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. I just feel lost. Like everyone else has it all figured out except me. Elizabeth reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. That's not true. Most people are just as confused as you are. They're just better at hiding it. Her words seemed to resonate with him, and he leaned back against the couch, exhaling deeply. I don't know what I'm doing, Mom. Sometimes I feel like I'm just stuck. Elizabeth's heart ached at his vulnerability. She wanted to help him, to ease the burden he was carrying, but she wasn't sure how. Her own experiences with loneliness and uncertainty had been buried beneath years of responsibility, but they surfaced now, reminding her of how isolating those feelings could be. Owen, she said after a pause, her voice trembling slightly, I want to help you. I don't want you to feel like you're going through this alone. He looked at her with a mix of hope and apprehension. What do you mean? Elizabeth hesitated, her mind racing as she tried to find the right words. I mean, sometimes when we don't know what to do, it helps to have someone guide us. Someone we can trust. Owen frowned slightly, his brow furrowing in confusion. Like a therapist. She shook her head, though the thought had crossed her mind. No, not exactly. I mean someone who knows you. Someone who understands what you're going through. The room seemed to grow smaller, the air heavier as the implications of her words hung between them. Owen's expression shifted, his confusion giving way to something more uncertain, more vulnerable. Are you saying you want to help me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth nodded, her hand still resting on his arm. If you'll let me. His eyes searched hers, and for a moment she saw the child he used to be, the boy who looked to her for guidance in a world that often felt too big and too overwhelming. I don't know, Mom. It feels weird. I know, she admitted, her voice soft but steady. But sometimes the people who love us the most are the ones who can help us the most. And I love you, Owen. More than anything. Her words seemed to break something in him, and he leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. I don't want to mess everything up, he said, his voice muffled and raw. Elizabeth placed a reassuring hand on his back, her touch firm yet gentle. You're not going to mess anything up. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you're going through, we'll face it together. One step at a time. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that allowed for healing, for understanding to take root. Finally, Owen looked up, his eyes red but determined. Okay, he said quietly. But can we take it slow? I don't want to mess this up. Elizabeth smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. Of course, Owen. As slow as you need. They sat together for a while longer, the weight of their conversation settling into something more manageable. The bond between them, though tested, felt stronger now, fortified by their willingness to confront the unspoken. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the window, Elizabeth felt a sense of cautious hope. This was not the resolution to all their struggles, but it was a beginning, a step toward understanding, toward connection, toward healing. She glanced at Owen, who had leaned back against the couch. His eyes closed but his expression peaceful. For the first time in a long while, she felt like they were truly a team. Two imperfect people navigating a complicated world together. And as the morning light bathed the room in warmth, Elizabeth resolved to do whatever it took to help her son find his way, no matter how long it took or how difficult the journey might be. The morning came slowly, its light trickling into the Parker household like a tentative knock on a door. Elizabeth stirred on the living room couch, her neck stiff from the awkward position she had fallen asleep in. Beside her, Owen was still asleep, his head tilted back against the cushions, his chest rising and falling steadily. For a moment, Elizabeth simply watched him, her heart heavy yet hopeful. Last night's conversation had cracked something open between them, but it also left her with questions she wasn't sure how to answer. She had promised to help him, to guide him through whatever it was he was struggling with, but the weight of that responsibility lingered, an invisible thread tugging at her every thought. By the time Owen stirred, the sun was fully up, bathing the room in golden light. He blinked groggily, rubbing the sleep from his eyes before glancing at Elizabeth. For a split second, there was a flash of vulnerability in his expression, but it was quickly replaced with something more guarded. "Morning," he mumbled, sitting up and stretching. "Morning," Elizabeth replied softly, offering him a small smile. "How are you feeling?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the coffee table. "I don't know. Still kind of weird, I guess." "That's okay," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "These things take time." He nodded, but the silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Elizabeth could sense that he wanted to say more, but she didn't want to push him. Instead, she stood and stretched, her joints protesting after a night on the couch. "How about some breakfast?" she offered, trying to inject a note of normalcy into the moment. "Sure," he said, standing as well. They moved to the kitchen, the clinking of plates and the hiss of the stove filling the air. Elizabeth busied herself with frying eggs and toasting bread, while Owen leaned against the counter, watching her in silence. She could feel his eyes on her, and though she didn't acknowledge it, she knew he was wrestling with something. Finally, as she set the plates on the table, he spoke. "Mom. About last night." She looked up, her expression open and encouraging. "What about it?" I don't want things to get weird between us," he said, his voice hesitant. "I mean, they already kind of are, but I don't want to mess things up even more." Elizabeth sat down across from him, her hands folded on the table. "Owen, things are only weird if we let them be. What we talked about last night, what you're feeling, it's not wrong or bad. It's just complicated." He nodded slowly, poking at his eggs with his fork. Complicated." They ate in silence for a few moments, the tension between them ebbing and flowing like waves. Elizabeth wanted to say something to reassure him, but she also knew the importance of giving him space to process. Finally, Owen broke the silence. "Do you ever feel like you're not enough? Like no matter what you do, it's never going to be enough?" Elizabeth's heart ached at his words. "All the time," she admitted. "Especially after your dad left. I felt like I had to be everything for you, both a mom and a dad, and no matter how hard I tried, it never felt like it was enough." He looked up at her, his expression a mix of surprise and understanding. "Really? You always seemed like you had it all together." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Trust me, Owen, I didn't. I still don't. But that's the thing about life. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to keep trying." He nodded again, his posture relaxing slightly. "I guess that makes sense." They finished their breakfast in companionable silence, the tension between them slowly dissipating. By the time they cleared the table, Elizabeth felt a sense of cautious optimism. They still had a long way to go, but she could see the beginnings of a stronger bond forming between them, built on honesty and understanding. The rest of the day passed quietly. Owen retreated to his room for a while, and Elizabeth took the opportunity to catch up on household chores. As she folded laundry in the living room, she found herself reflecting on their conversation and what it meant for their relationship. When Owen emerged from his room later that afternoon, he seemed more at ease. He sat down on the couch beside her, picking up a stray sock and folding it neatly. "Thanks for being there for me, Mom," he said, his voice sincere. Elizabeth looked at him, her heart swelling with pride and love. "Always, Owen. No matter what." For the first time in what felt like years, she saw a genuine smile on his face, a small but significant sign that they were moving in the right direction. As the day turned to evening, they decided to watch a movie together, something they hadn't done in months. The familiar routine brought a sense of comfort and normalcy, a reminder that even in the midst of uncertainty, they could still find moments of connection and joy. By the time the credits rolled, Elizabeth felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She glanced at Owen, who had dozed off on the couch beside her, his head resting against the cushions. She knew their journey was far from over, and there would be more challenges ahead. But for now, she was content to simply be there for him, to offer him the love and support he needed to find his way. As she turned off the TV and draped a blanket over him, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She might not have all the answers, but she had something even more important, the determination to be there for her son no matter what. And in that moment, as the house settled into quiet stillness, Elizabeth realized that she wasn't just helping Owen find his way. She was finding her own as well.